All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our informational webinar. My name is Jessica Black and I will be helping facilitate the discussion today. At Elevation Strategic Development, we help companies like yours navigate clinical, quality, and regulatory challenges and hurdles. We have a passion for driving diagnostic, medical device, and pharmaceutical innovations to market for the improvement of patient care. And today we're excited to discuss the ever so timely topic of LDTs and the proposed rule by FDA. What we're going to do is if you have questions during this webinar, we simply ask that you type them into the chat window. We'll be addressing them during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. We want to ensure that we get through the material that Stacy has planned today. But we hope by the end of today, you'll feel more informed about the proposed rule and its impacts that it might have on you and your organization. Really, the goal here today is to inform you and help navigate what is to come. We will have follow-up webinars once the ruling has been solidified. So be sure and check our website, check our emails, our LinkedIn pages for up-to-date information. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today. It's Elevation's founder and CEO, Dr. Stacy Carney. Stacy is an expert in clinical, quality, and regulatory in the IVD industry. Her experience not only lies in the development of diagnostic products, but also in the implementation of clinical laboratory operations. Therefore, Dr. Carney has a unique perspective on the transition from delivery of an LDT to an FDA review of IVD. For the last decade, she has worked to weave together CLIA and FDA regulations into manageable quality systems for companies and laboratories. Dr. Carney has a PhD in immunology from the University of Colorado and has maintained her regulatory affairs certifications since 2015. So I'm going to turn it over to Stacy. She's going to walk us through this presentation. Again, any questions, please put those in the chat and we will answer those at the end of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And I'd like to echo Jessica and thanking everyone for joining us today. This is such an important topic for the IVD industry as well as the clinical laboratory industry. We really want to take an opportunity to help stay informed and provide some of our perspective on the impacts that this rule could have to our industry. So that will be the purpose here today. We are going to try to get through our material, but leave ample time at the end for questions. So we welcome multiple questions and we will have about 20 minutes at the end to get through those. But today, our main topic is the FDA proposed rule on the regulation of LDTs. We're going to try to give you the most up-to-date information we have as of today. Our agenda today will be just an overview of the proposed rule, what it is. We'll give you FDA's rationale for their enforcement discretion change, which this does represent a change in the way FDA has been approaching LDTs. We'll give you a summary of the history of FDA's efforts to regulate LDTs in the manner they are proposing, their statements on their regulatory authority to do so, the scope, importantly, the scope and timeline of the proposed change, and then our description of the implications of the 5-stage enforcement discretion phase out. We're also going to give you some updated information. There was a webinar given by FDA in October. There also was a recent development last week in the proposed rule moving to the White House. So we're going to give you as much up-to-date information that happened even just a few days ago as we can. So importantly, the purpose and scope of the presentation is intended to provide you information on FDA's proposed rule, which was published in October. The information contained is directly derived from FDA's published proposed rule, and therefore it does primarily represent FDA's perspective. So it's not intended to present an opinion or any external commentary on the proposed rule, but really to provide you with current information as we have it today. Today's presentation and the Q&A session will therefore refrain from providing any commentary or discussion on the merits of FDA's approach, because there are certainly multiple opinions on both sides of the argument. So rather, we're going to look at the implications if it does move to implementation. So a presentation, as Jessica noted, that outlines the final rule will be generated and made available when that final rule is published. And you can visit our website or our LinkedIn to find these updated presentations. So FDA's proposed rule, so in general, FDA has considered an LDT to be an IVD intended for clinical use, designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. And up until release of this proposed rule, they have provided enforcement discretion, meaning they believed they had the authority to regulate LDTs, but refrained from doing so until now. With the proposed rule, FDA intends to amend the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR, to update the definition for in vitro diagnostics. And that definition is contained under 21 CFR 809. So the updated regulations will now state that IVDs are devices under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, including when the manufacturer of these products is a laboratory. And it's that small clause at the end that is the update that is having the impact we are seeing in the LDT space. So the amendment is intended to reflect that the agency will no longer differentiate between entities manufacturing IVDs, including when it's a laboratory. So whether it is a commercial company or a laboratory within any type of institution, that could be an academic institution, a standalone laboratory, or any other laboratory, it will be considered a manufacturer when providing a diagnostic test. The result of the proposed rule will be for FDA to phase out their general enforcement discretion over a period of time for these LDTs, laboratory developed tests. Under the proposed rule, importantly, FDA will regulate LDTs like IVDs. So laboratories must comply with all relevant FDA requirements for these devices. FDA is putting some boundaries around what they expect laboratories to do, but in general, the requirements within FDA for medical devices will apply now to LDTs. So one question certainly is why now, and why the very strong push to move this forward. In 1976, the medical device amendments allowed for the comprehensive regulation of medical devices under the FDA&C. And in implementing the medical device amendments, FDA generally excluded LDTs at the time in the 1970s because they believed the types of tests LDTs represented in the 1970s did not warrant review by FDA. So then in the 1970s, they were mostly manufactured in small volumes and intended to serve their local communities. They were typically intended for diagnosing rare diseases, generally similar to well-characterized standardized tests, employed by manual techniques, not automation, and manufactured using components legally marketed for clinical use. FDA's perspective on what has changed and why they feel it is important to regulate them now is that now they see some LDTs are manufactured in high volume. They're intended for larger, more diverse populations with samples accepted nationwide. They're used to inform direct treatment decisions, including for serious or widespread diseases, such as those in oncology or infectious disease. They have their novel tests with novel analytes or biomarkers, and they can be reliant on complex or high-tech instrumentation and software. And they also made the argument that they're designed with instruments or components not legally marketed for clinical use, often known within the laboratory setting as RUO, research use only type components. So looking at the difference between the two timeframes, FDA's rationale for phasing out enforcement discretion has been that they are asserting that modern LDTs are associated with much greater risks today to public health. The testing landscape has evolved significantly since the MDA implementation in the 70s. FDA reports witnessing an explosion in the volume, complexity, and scope of IVDs offered as LDTs. FDA is questioning the reliability of LDTs and provides evidence in their proposed rule from published studies, allegations from healthcare providers, FDA's experience in reviewing LDTs submitted for marketing applications, particularly leaning in the proposed rule on their experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. They use news articles as well as class action lawsuits. So FDA notes that industry has come to view FDA's enforcement discretion approach as an alternative pathway to market for test systems. But these test systems, launched as LDTs, lack the characteristics and institutional safeguards of past tests and may compete with FDA authorized tests. Again, we are paraphrasing FDA here from their proposed rule. FDA's benefit and risk assessment of the LDT regulation is that given the role that LDTs play in modern medical care, the validity of the tests has a significant impact on public health because false results can affect diagnosis and treatment. So FDA notes several sources that demonstrate there is a high variability in the performance of LDTs across the country. So including when test technology is relatively simple and well understood, tests for rare diseases as well as low risk tests. So applying the same oversight to laboratory and non-laboratory manufacturers would remove a disincentive for non-laboratory businesses to develop tests, thereby spurring, not encouraging innovation. In FDA's opinion, applying a phase-out approach accounts for the level of public health concern and the importance of avoiding undue disruption to the testing market, including undue disruption to the provision of care. This is not FDA's first attempt to regulate LDTs. For those of us who followed this very closely, this goes back decades. We've noted here some of the major milestones, but today what we'd really like to point out to you are the last three. In 2014, FDA did publish a draft guidance and attempted to regulate LDTs through guidance, in which they put forward a framework not dissimilar to today, in which FDA would fully regulate LDTs like IVDs. More than 300 sets of comments were received in favor of and against the proposed oversight. However, due to many legal challenges, some gray areas, and a lot of headwind that FDA faced, they did withdraw the guidance in 2016 and did away with their effort to regulate LDTs at the time. 3 years later, they published a discussion paper that was the synthesis of the 2014 draft guidance comments that they were listening to, proposing what they called a compromised approach in response to the feedback. It looked like a hybrid of FDA and CMS oversight with the addition of 4 QMS items and tailored pre-market review. We note this discussion paper because it is the 4 same items FDA is indicating are lacking between CLIA and the quality system regulation currently for medical devices. So in that discussion paper, they did put forward part of what they were how they were going to regulate LDTs. Most recently, the VALID Act was put forward as actual legislation to move through Congress. This was not only directed specifically at LDTs, but it was a complete overhaul of the IVD regulation, in which FDA would now separate out regulation of IVDs from medical devices in general. This is a fairly similar framework to the way the European Union regulates IVDs, in which medical devices and IVDs are regulated separately. The VALID Act did fail to move through Congress in 2022. Therefore, FDA determined it was necessary for them to act through the rulemaking pathway since legislation was not going to be passed. Unfortunately, the current proposed rule is further reaching in scope than most past proposals due to the failure of the VALID Act. So where FDA sees, as we noted, FDA sees gaps between the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid authority over clinical laboratory operations and their oversight on test performance review. So FDA notes that CLIA, the clinical laboratory regulations, is not sufficient to provide the healthcare community with adequate assurance of safety and effectiveness of a diagnostic test offered as an LDT. The regulatory schemes of FDA and CMS, they claim, are different in focus, scope, and purpose. They are meant to be complementary, but each agency has their own specific set of expertise they bring to the table. While FDA asserts this directly in their proposed rule, FDA and CMS did put out a joint memo agreeing that this is that they do have separate but complementary focuses. So FDA establishes requirements pertaining to manufacturing, development, and performance evaluation. They are focused on analytical and clinical validity, and they review performance for tests prior to use. CMS, as stated by these agencies, establishes requirements pertaining to laboratory operations, inspections, and certification. They are focused on clinical utility, and they review proficiency in performing tests. So as these two agencies see it, the primary gaps between the quality system regulation and the clinical laboratory improvement amendments that govern clinical laboratory operations are the absence of regulatory performance review prior to test deployment, manufacturing provisions for design controls, acceptance activities, CAPAs, and purchasing controls. Those are the four they're going to focus on. They also note certain records requirements deficiencies. They also assert there is a lack of evaluation of clinical validity assessment prior to deploying the LDT. So I'm not going to go into this slide in detail. Jessica will be providing the slides after our webinar today, so you can use this as a resource if you'd like to know. But I wanted to put it up here today so that FDA laid out a very, very long argument on their legal authority to regulate LDTs within the proposed rule. FDA's arguments, they highlight the following arguments based on their authority. They believe they have the authority to amend 21 CFR 809, which defines IVDs within our code, the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, under the agency's general rulemaking authorities and statutory authorities relating to devices within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. They are asserting that test systems are sets of IVDs that function together to produce a result, and they cite another portion of the Code of Federal Regulations. And most importantly, for their argument that will likely be challenged is that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does not exclude medical professionals who manufacture devices from its scope, and laboratory manufacturing is not immune from regulation because it is within the practice of medicine per the FD&C's practice of medicine provision. So this provision notes that nothing in the Act should be construed to limit or interfere with the authority of a healthcare practitioner to prescribe or administer a legally marketed device to a patient for their care. But the purpose, according to FDA, of the provision is to ensure that once the FDA permits a device to be marketed for use by healthcare practitioners, they then have the flexibility to draw on their expertise to prescribe or administer the device. We often hear it called off-label use. So FDA is asserting that LDTs have not undergone the process to be authorized for marketed use by FDA. It should be noted that as in the past with the draft guidance, it is expected that FDA will experience numerous and swift legal challenges to the proposed rule once it is final and becomes the final rule. These legal challenges won't begin until the rule is final, but these are some of the arguments that likely are to be attacked once those lawsuits begin. So getting to the heart of it, what is the scope of the enforcement's discretion and how could this affect your operations? So FDA does intend to apply a phase-out policy to LDTs offered by laboratories for CLIA certified for high complexity testing. So it's going to be an approximate 4-year phase-out period where IVDs offered as LDTs generally would be expected to meet applicable requirements under FDA regulations. Importantly, under the proposed rule, unlike in the VALID Act, there will be no grandfathering for use under this rule. So if you are currently using an LDT within your laboratory or develop it during the phase-out period and begin offering it, you will have to come into compliance with the FDA requirements that they set forth by the final rule by the end of the phase-out period, or you must cease offering the LDT for clinical use. FDA did note they are going to continue the enforcement discretion for very limited types of testing. Their specific examples they list were 1976 type LDTs in which they originally had the idea for enforcement discretion, human leukocyte antigen testing testing intended only for forensics or for public health surveillance. So there are not many LDTs that deploy high complexity testing that will be exempt from being required to meet the rule. That is the largest impact that is going to be felt by laboratories. So the 4-year phase out period is intended to happen in approximately 5 stages, or it will happen in 5 stages. So FDA notes that in recognition to take time, that it's going to take time for laboratories to come into compliance and prevent negatively affecting the public, FDA proposes to phase it out in the 5 stages. In general, this timeline is designed to coincide with the next User Fee Act negotiation, which is set to happen and go into effect in the fall of 2027. It is the expectation of those in the industry in general who are following this closely that the final rule will be published in approximately April or May of this year. So approximately 1 or 2 months from now, less than 2 months from now. We're going to explain why there are those that feel that way, but that's why we are timely having this webinar, because we feel this is imminent and it is going to happen. So we're going to go through each of these stages in a little more detail and what they entail and what the implications they could have to you. But we do want to note that as of the fall of 2027, laboratories may need to be prepared to go through a Class 3 PMA review for any of their tests that would be categorized as Class 3 devices under FDA rules. By April, 4 years from now, laboratories will need to be prepared to go under FDA review for any Class 2 devices that could be for LDTs that could be classified as Class 2 devices. This is very important because this gives laboratories approximately 3 years to be prepared to submit an FDA application, prior to which the quality management system and the development of the LDT must meet FDA expectations. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each stage, talk about the timing and the impacts it could have to your laboratory. So the first stage is going to require medical device reporting and correction and removal reporting by laboratories. This is expected to go into effect by April of next year if the final rule was to be published in April or early May of this year. So for medical device reporting, you'll be required to report on complaints and adverse events observed or known for the use of the test. And you'll have to follow the process to identify, review, and report adverse events in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations under Part 803. So laboratories should typically have such a system for complaints and medical device reporting. However, this is likely going to require some additional effort within your quality team and documentation to fully comply as a standard quality system regulation manufacturer. For correction and removal, laboratories will be required to report when modifications occur to a test or it's removed from the test menu. This is quite typically different from the way we do this in standard laboratory operations under CLIA, meaning those modifications, laboratories do make modifications to their validated LDTs, and then they will put that in their documentation for the validated test. FDA is noting that you will have to actually report on these when a test is modified or your test menu is modified. So laboratories must establish a Part 806 compliant process for reporting, including the CLIA certificate number on the documentation. So the reporting is not annual or contained in the QMS documentation. It must recur within 10 working days. So this reporting will be in addition to the revisions to a test menu for a CLIA certificate. Because in Part 2, or in Stage 2, excuse me, of the phase out period, laboratories will be required to register and list their tests. So you will now be required to register yourself as a manufacturer and each of the tests you offer as an LDT on FDA's website. Information such as the facility address, the owner contact information, correspondent information, and test names must be listed. This isn't specifically different from those you might include on your CMS 116. However, this is a public database. The registration also has an annual fee. An official correspondent must be named in the registration information, and any changes must be updated at least annually to your manufacturer information. Again, this is going to occur at year 2, April of 2026, approximately 2 years from now. You must have these processes in place. For labeling, laboratories must develop labeling for their LDT being offered, and that labeling must meet requirements under Part 809 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It is more extensive than what we might normally refer to as a procedure manual that would outline the instructions on how to use or how to perform an LDT within a laboratory. What is currently unclear at the moment is how this information will have to be presented to the receivers of the test, or will they need to be made public? Currently, manufacturers don't necessarily have to make their instructions for use public. They provide them to the users of the test. So how this will be approached and implemented is not quite clear, and FDA will have to provide guidance on what will be required. The third item for the stage 2 would be that laboratories must comply with investigational use regulations if the testing supports a clinical trial. So for clinical research, a laboratory's quality management system, it must support compliance with the medical device investigational use, which is Part 812 of our Code of Federal Regulations. FDA actually already expects compliance with this part, but they are now saying directly to laboratories that CLIA certification does not preclude compliance with the medical device investigational use regulations. This is called the Investigational Device Exemption Regulations. And also, laboratories should be complying with good clinical practices for investigational use. Again, many laboratories who perform clinical research already comply with this. FDA just wants to make it explicit at this time. CLIA certification is not sufficient. Stage 3 will occur approximately 3 years from now, and this will be the first stage in which it is our opinion will be one of the big lifts laboratories will have to implement. FDA is going to require that laboratories comply with the quality system regulation for medical devices. So laboratories must update their quality management system to meet FDA regulations plus CLIA regulations, if you're going to also perform the test, which most laboratories would. The quality management system for both authorities must be maintained for development and clinical testing. And a laboratory must follow the formal design controls process to develop tests. Again, this may be one of the biggest differences currently between the way laboratories operate and the way FDA will expect to see documentation for a product that will go under review. While FDA is noting that laboratories must come into compliance with the quality system regulation, it is noted that it is not meant to be redundant, and they do want to make sure there is a feasible complementary approach to putting these two quality management systems together. Like in their discussion paper, FDA notes four primary areas not covered by CLIA that they feel need to be considered and put into a quality management system. They are design controls, purchasing, corrective action and preventative action, and acceptance activities. As our recommendation, laboratories should consider weaving these areas into their current quality management system if they aren't already present. We have actually done this for quality management systems before, and many laboratories have the beginnings of these types of processes. It's even been argued to FDA that CLIA does cover some of these items, but perhaps it's not covered in the way FDA would like to see. And so the request is for FDA to provide guidance on exactly what is missing and what should be included. We have done this assessment, and we feel like there are provisions within CLIA that begin the purchasing process, as well as corrective action process and acceptance activities for products. Design controls are one place where clinical laboratory regulations do not provide a lot of guidance, neither do CAP checklists provide a lot of guidance or detail or robustness on the design controls process. So this may be one place where there are new processes that laboratories will have to implement. It's also important to note that this will be a single site. We call this a single site setting. So the test itself will still be manufactured and delivered within a single laboratory. So not all of the requirements under the quality system regulation for medical devices are actually applicable to that single site setting. And so those need to be parsed out so that we don't unintentionally have burden in our quality management system that isn't necessary. So our recommendation is to focus directly on those 4 areas FDA notes. So FDA also, recently, we have a lot of movement in the medical device space right now. FDA released a final rule just recently that the quality system regulation will be updated to be harmonized with an ISO standard for medical devices. We call this the ISO 13485 standard. So what this means is we're going to harmonize the quality system regulation in the US with the generally accepted standards globally. Many laboratories or manufacturers comply with both the quality management system and the ISO system. For laboratories who don't yet comply with the quality system regulation, we are urging you to please consider this transition FDA is going through when you're designing your laboratory QMS. The US quality system regulation and the global medical device standard are very similar in nature, but there are some differences. So since FDA is making this transition, it's important to just go ahead and make this transition with them if you're going to think about updating your quality management system. So stage 4 will happen approximately 3.5 years from now, which would be October 2027, again, intended specifically to coincide with implementation of our next User Fee Act or MDUFA implementation. FDA intends to require that LDTs that would be classified as Class 3 devices under FDA rules would be going under review first, given their risk to public health. Class 3 submissions undergo what is called a pre-market approval application process. It will likely require establishment of regulatory affairs resources for the lab. These are large packages that must be submitted. If the IVD contains software, enhanced software documentation will be required. So again, it may require some specialized resources within the laboratory in order to perform this development as well as the documentation. It will be a challenge that a laboratory will have approximately 6 months after the quality management system requirement is in place to submit a pre-market approval to FDA to remain compliant with offering an LDT. Importantly, another announcement FDA made within the last few months is that they do intend to potentially down-classify certain IVDs, including companion diagnostics, from Class 3 to Class 2. It's speculated that a part of this announcement is due to the fact FDA is anticipating an extremely large amount of LDTs that would need to move through the Class 3 process and are intending to try to downgrade these IVDs to Class 2. They believe this will happen. They have already done it for certain infectious disease tests that have well-known technology. So this will likely be a slow process. We have no idea how this will affect the current rule. We are just putting it forward as a piece of information that seems to be related to the current environment for LDTs. So a pre-market application, as we noted, is quite a large package. It does require submission of your actual manufacturing documents, as well as a pre-approval inspection of the facility. So you would need to be prepared to be inspected by FDA. FDA did note that continued use of an LDT would be allowed during their review process if an application is submitted prior to the deadline. This, in our opinion, is FDA's note that they are recognizing their resource may be limited and it may take them longer than the standard 6-month process to get through the volume of PMAs that will be submitted once October of 2027 comes around. 4 years from now, laboratories must be prepared to submit what's called a pre-market notification to FDA for any Class 2 devices, LDTs, that they would like to continue offering. Class 2 devices can go through what's called the 510K or the de novo request process. These are less burdensome than the PMA process because the risk of the device is lower in FDA's opinion. But however, they are still large packages and they are likely to require establishment of a regulatory affairs resource for the laboratory. Similarly, for the Class 3 devices, if an IVD contains software, basic software documentation will be required. This is a lower level than enhanced software documentation, but it still often requires a technical resource in order to perform the development to a software development standard, as well as create the documentation. Again, unfortunately, in a pretty condensed time frame, a laboratory will have approximately 1 year after the quality management system requirement under stage 3 to submit an application. It's also unclear if FDA's down classification announcement are going to affect the IVDs that require a PMA. So laboratories who think perhaps now that they may be a Class 3 device, perhaps they have until April of 2028 to submit their marketing application. We are going to try to stay very up to date on what is happening and put out information as we can, as we understand it, and as we can provide our interpretation of it. But for right now, we wish we could give you more clarity and definition, but until things continue to move and FDA continues to put out guidance, we can only go on what FDA has put in the proposed rule at this time. So laboratories should evaluate what current paperwork could support design and submission documentation. As I noted, laboratories, when going through an analytical validation process for their LDT, document the performance of their LDT. So there perhaps may be some documentation already present in your records you could use to leverage a design file for some of these LDTs. Similar to the Class 3 devices, continued use of the LDT will be allowed during FDA's review if an application is submitted prior to the deadline. So those are the 5 stages of implementation. FDA did hold a webinar on October 31st, approximately a month after the proposed rule was published, to highlight key points of the proposed rule and answer 26 pre-selected questions that were submitted by the audience members in advance of the webinar. Below are just a list of our selected highlights focused on FDA's intention for resource management and implementation of the proposed rule. And we selected these because we feel these are where laboratories and companies will feel the largest burden. We want to note that FDA's answers during the webinar were derived from information already provided within the proposed rule. The one new item they did note, they were not going to give an extension to the comment period, which they did not. And so the comment period stayed to 60 days. We note that even within that 60-day comment period, I believe just south of 20,000 comments were submitted to FDA on this proposed rule to the formal docket. So FDA highlighted that CLIA and CMS oversight is meant to be complementary, but CLIA regulations are not sufficient to ensure the safety and effectiveness of diagnostic tests. FDA maintains the expertise for making these assessments. To improve management resources, FDA will consider leveraging qualified third parties for review and inspection of LDTs, such as the New York State Clinical Laboratory Program or other qualified organizations that are experts in laboratory operations. They have noted CAP in previous proposals, but it is unclear how these private organizations might engage with FDA. FDA will apply compliance to the quality system regulation requirements relevant to tests conducted within a single laboratory, which are complementary to the quality management system requirements already in place under CLIA, which we discussed about while going through stage 3. So it's this weaving together of these different regulations rather than trying to maintain 2 quality management systems. FDA also noted that they can accept literature-based evidence in support of clinical validity as long as it sufficiently supports the safety and efficacy according to the intended use. This was something we noted because often laboratories will perform their LDTs and they will publish information on the use of those LDTs. Sometimes these LDTs can also be noted in certain guidelines for clinical care. So we encourage laboratories to evaluate whether or not there are certain patients as well as guidelines that would support performance of your LDT that you could use in a submission. So as we noted when we went through the timeline for the proposed rule, there is an expectation currently in the industry that the final rule will be published in the next month or so. This is because in the last week, I believe 3 days ago, FDA and the HHS submitted the final rule to the White House Office of Management and Budget for review. So it has hit the White House desk for review. Given the speed in which this rule was submitted to the White House after an end to the comment period, it is speculated, including by Scott Gottlieb on social media outlets, that the final rule is likely to have little changes from the proposed rule. This is important to note because, as we noted at the beginning of the webinar, the proposed rule is quite broad and far-reaching in its implementation. And so it is unlikely things that were potentially asked for during the comment period, like extensions of the timeframes for the phase-out or grandfathering of certain types of tests, including for rare diseases or others, will not be included in the final rule. Certainly, we cannot see that. We are just preparing for it. We believe this is going to happen because to avoid the risk that the final rule will be subject to the Congressional Review Act, in which Congress could review and possibly have issues with the final rule, they have a deadline of May 22nd to publish this without the risk of that review. So this was certainly a lot of information for us to present to you today. We want to thank you for your time. Jessica, I'd like to, if there are any questions in the chat, I'm happy to begin going through the questions.
Thank you, Stacy. Yes, if you have some questions for Stacy, she will be willing to answer live. You can develop those in the chat function, and we will just kind of go in the order that we have received them. Right now, Stacy, we don't have any questions in the chat.
Okay.
So if there's something that you want to kind of dive a little deeper in, please feel free.
Hey, Jessica, I see 2 Q&As in the Q&A.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, yep, sorry. No, they were in the Q&A, not the chat. You're right. Okay. Okay, so the first question we have, I'm just going to read this, Stacy, out loud to you, or you can follow along in the Q&A as well. As a provider of a research tool that is software, we see labs applying the tool through their LDT application. While this will this rule push the labs to instead require 510(k) release tools to avoid their need to perform LDT submissions?
Fantastic question, and the answer is yes. And I think that's one way in which this rule really, we have a focus right now on how the rule is going to affect laboratories. However, I think importantly, this is going to have an effect on manufacturers as well, because manufacturers will develop research tools, as you're noting. One area of our expertise is in digital pathology development, and the software, as you're noting, can components or applications within that software. Laboratories, if they have access to those applications, can bring them into their laboratory and validate them within their own test systems in order to offer them as a diagnostic. This is something laboratories often enjoy because they feel that they can get access to innovation and put it forward into patient care in their hands in a more efficient way or a faster way than what they're seeing come through the FDA review process. One of the primary items this will affect is the ability of a laboratory to do that. That does not mean that the laboratory cannot take that component and bring it into their laboratory and develop it as a product. We see this in the IVD industry already, where single site IVDs, this happens a lot in the next generation sequencing area, for example, where research use components, whether they are reagents, instrumentation, et cetera, are used in a single site setting, but they do undergo FDA review. So to directly answer your question, laboratories will still be able to use those components, but they will have to validate them in their laboratory and bring them through FDA review as a component. So often this will also require that the laboratories have some sort of agreement that they have control over any changes to that software or that instrumentation or that reagent with the manufacturer, the original research manufacturer. Thank you so much for your question. I think that's one of the areas where we're seeing a lot of it's crossing lines between manufacturers and laboratories as to how the impact could be quite broad. I think importantly, the other area, and apologies, Jessica, really quickly, I know we have another question, but another area we are encouraging manufacturers of research components to start to see a little more risk and be a little more careful is in your marketing. And when I say marketing, when you go into a laboratory and talk about your research component, being careful on your website or in your marketing materials to not advertise that this could be put into an LDT or could be used for clinical use. This is very important. FDA is starting to look at this more carefully, and they're starting to take notice of it. This could result in a cease and desist or a warning letter. And so we're not saying it will happen to you. We're not saying FDA has the resource to scan the industry like that at this time, but it's possible. And the risk of it is increasing. So they're looking more carefully. So also we're encouraging manufacturers to consider that a little more carefully as well. Jessica, happy to take the next question.
Yeah, we've got 3 more in the queue.
Okay.
So I'm just going to answer or state those in the order that they were received. So issues like labeling that don't make sense for LDTs as written. What do you think the chances are of FDA drafting additional LDT specific guidance to help laboratories move into compliance?
Excellent question. And I think it's one reason we're being very careful to not create definitive recommendations, or we're kind of not encouraging laboratories to start the process yet. We're encouraging to start the planning, but not the actual implementation, because FDA has stated they will have guidance. They will put out guidance on their expectations, either what needs to go in the quality management system. And I love the question about labeling, because this is one I'm quite confused on as well, because I see a laboratory procedure manual really as an instruction for use and I don't know exactly what we need beyond that for labeling, because it's unclear why labeling would need to be made public in this setting when it is not in others. So that's a very good question. So I would say yes, FDA has already stated they're going to put out guidance. The one concern is it takes FDA a long time to put out guidance, and we only have a 4-year process. So one thing we're also noting to laboratories is, a watch and wait is an important place to be right now, and do some planning and think about the areas where you might have gaps. But the waiting too long for FDA guidance may get you too close to the timeline. So there's going to be a little bit of a balance moving forward, but we absolutely believe there will be guidance. And obviously we hope the guidance for the first stage comes out first, and et cetera, so that we can start implementing properly. Wonderful question. Thank you.
Great. Okay, another question. Drug sponsors often use results from LDTs to determine patient eligibility.
Mm-hmm.
Do you foresee new responsibilities for sponsors of drug studies with this new rule?
Possibly. I love that question because we're seeing in Europe, for example, with the implementation of the IVDR, and for any of our audience members who are navigating both the US and the EU market are probably groaning at the moment, because the implementation of the IVDR in Europe has put a substantial increase in responsibilities for sponsors in order to utilize assays within a clinical program in Europe. And while we're unsure how this proposed rule could change the application of LDTs, it is clear that FDA noted the investigational use provision. So as I said, in stage 2, they are putting forward sponsors, you need to pay attention to the IDE regulations when you're going to put an assay in a clinical program, even as far back as phase 1. Because a lot of sponsors are using patient selection all the way far back as stage 1. That doesn't mean you're going to get an IDE, or that we're going to change the analytical validation requirements, which typically meet CLIA. What I think is complex here, though, is FDA is making that assertion, but the CMS is not changing their assertion that you also have to meet CLIA requirements in order to do that. So on that front, I think the burden will go up. How it will be different from those who already consider both of those, I'm not sure how much it will change, but I think therapeutic sponsors are now going to have to be more cognizant of the device regulations. I absolutely agree.
Great. Last one that I'm seeing, realistic ability for the FDA to handle all the paperwork from the labs in a timely manner. Probably that the suits to come push off the dates. That's a question.
Yes, I think that's why we're sort of in a watch and wait. And we noted early on that the lawsuits will come almost immediately. In fact, I think a few of them are ready, and they're just waiting for the final rule to come out in order to file them. So yes, I believe there's a thought that the lawsuits are going to require that the time frame gets pushed out. Another